Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. My name is Cristina. I'm a political science and international relations major here at BU, and I'll be presenting my project, Atomic Adaptations, Analyzing the Past and Present of U.S. Nonproliferation Policy in the Middle East. Within IR, my concentration has been in Middle East and North Africa studies, and I've also been doing nuclear studies for a little over 2 years now. This project was for honors in international relations. My final product was a very, very long research paper that I will condense for all of you today. So a bit of a sense of the roadmap for my presentation. I will start off giving you my research questions, some basics of my project, then moving into my materials and methodology, and then proceeding into my country case studies of Israel and Iran, and then finally going into some findings about the discussion of U.S. nonproliferation policy over time, and then some final thoughts. This image here is a picture of President Lyndon B. Johnson and Secretary of State Dean Rusk signing the 1968 NPT, really foundational treaty for nonproliferation conversations. So my research question very generally asks, what can we learn about 21st century U.S. nonproliferation policy in the Middle East from its policies toward Israel and Iran in the 20th century? Nonproliferation, very generally, is the prevention of the spread of nuclear weapons. And I chose these two states, Israel and Iran in particular, because they are the two states with the most developed nuclear programs in the Middle East. Israel does have a nuclear weapons capability. It maintains a nuclear opacity policy by which the state is known to have nuclear weapons, except it is an undeclared status, meaning we don't really talk about it. Whereas Iran does not have nuclear weapons capability currently. However, it does operate nuclear energy and nuclear power facilities. So moving into some of my materials and methodology, my research methodology was primarily qualitative textual data analysis of secondary and primary sources, spending a lot of time in digital archives, the Wilson Center, the CIA, and presidential libraries. Sort of building the historical basis within these primary sources, and then also noting changes in U.S. officials thinking toward nonproliferation over time through national security documents, executive memoranda, and things of that nature. This image is a reconnaissance photo captured by a U.S. reconnaissance plane in the late 50s of construction at Dimona, which is the main Israeli nuclear facility. So moving into my research design, I primarily use inductive and deductive reasoning, and my thesis was structured by 3 research puzzles. The first one, U.S. policy in the Israeli nuclear program, then U.S. and the Iranian nuclear program, and finally a discussion of the development of U.S. nonproliferation policy over time. So for my first puzzle with the Israeli nuclear program, both Israel and Iran received nuclear assistance from the United States in the 1950s. The Israeli nuclear program progressed very quickly after that, despite the efforts of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. So in the Israeli nuclear program, a big key to this is that timing really matters in nonproliferation contexts. In one sense, because by the time the Nixon administration came to power, there was very little left for the United States to do in terms of restraining the nuclear program. Previous officials under the Kennedy and Johnson administration, Israeli officials were able to continue delaying confrontation with the United States to the point where by the time Nixon came around, there was really nothing that could be left to do, and the Nixon administration was therefore more concerned with limiting public knowledge of the Israeli capability as opposed to stopping it. And this was solidified by an agreement made by President Nixon and Prime Minister Golda Meir, which is one of their meetings is photographed here in the top photo. So then moving to the Iranian nuclear program, like I said, Iran, like Israel, received nuclear assistance from the United States in the 50s. However, it wasn't until after the 1979 Iranian Revolution that the regime began pursuing nuclear weapons more seriously. The Iranian program really highlights this tricky dual-use aspect of nuclear technology, wherein the same facilities and the same technology that can be used in civilian nuclear power and completely peaceful purposes can then also be used to try and procure nuclear weapons capabilities. So once Iran had that facility intact from its time as an ally to the United States, after the revolution, those things were still intact and enabled it to move forward in that program. This photo here at the bottom is a meeting in 2016 between the United States and Iran negotiating the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. You can see the difference in body language and really just the overall tone of these images just pictured here, and I think that that also speaks volumes. So another question the Iranian nuclear program raised is that the main way the US and the nonproliferation regime more generally has tried to handle that tricky dual-use aspect is through the requirement of international safeguards and verification. The Iranian program then begs the question of what happens if a state doesn't want to abide by those verifications and chooses to proceed without them. And this is where we see the rise of counterproliferation mechanisms moving from the 1990s until now. Whereas nonproliferation is primarily treaties, sanctions, things like that, counterproliferation is focused on counterintelligence, law enforcement, and can also include kinetic physical military strikes. So it's a little bit of a more violent aspect that gives the United States another way to respond should these traditional nonproliferation mechanisms be unsuccessful. In the Iranian nuclear program, we've seen this employed before. In 2010, for example, this political cartoon is characterizing the Stuxnet cyber attack. This was a cyber attack manufactured between the United States and Israel against the Iranian nuclear facilities. You can see in the picture there's a nuke that's malfunctioning, the virus popping up on the computer, and someone is asking, do we have a backup? So in addition to the cyber sabotage mechanism of counterproliferation, this also comes into play for the threat of military strikes. Israel in particular has demonstrated a willingness to use kinetic military force to stop its neighbors from developing nuclear programs, in a sense very much wanting to maintain Israel's current status as the only nuclear weapons possessing state in the region. So finally, the really main takeaway of my project has been that U.S. nonproliferation policy is not stagnant. It has evolved over many decades in many different ways. My personal hope would be that counterproliferation continues to evolve in tandem with nonproliferation policy. I do think that there is a lot of value to having the dialogue that comes from the diplomatic side, and I a little bit fear the escalatory aspect of counterproliferation. So I think that these things should be able to abide in tandem. We also see this playing out today with the Iran nuclear deal. This photo is taken from this past December. This is negotiations between European representatives and Iranian representatives trying to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Very notably, the United States is not present in these discussions, as the U.S. and Iran have not been negotiating in the same room up to this point. So finally, just thank you to everybody, my thesis advisor, the Pardee School, and the many of you that listened and helped me revise this project many times over. So I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful work. As people think about questions, maybe I'll ask, what are the takeaways from this history? What should, for example, the U.S. be doing? What should it have done differently, and what should it never do again?
It's a difficult question because the big sense of this project has been that in nonproliferation, it always feels like too little, too late. In the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration, this wasn't a concern back then. We were giving nuclear assistance away in a Cold War sense to try and gain allies. That ended up really not being very beneficial later on, but in the time, that made so much sense. I think the difference would be that now counterproliferation, I think, will be a major thing moving forward because it enables states to use things like cyber sabotage, where it's much harder to trace that back to them, but it still provides a really effective way of making a mark in preventing nuclear weapons development should traditional mechanisms fail.
I was very interested when you mentioned that Nixon's policy toward Israel became more about limiting public knowledge of their nuclear weapons than actually limiting the nuclear weapons. And do we see that elsewhere in U.S. nuclear policy, where it's more about sort of managing what the public knows or fears about these capabilities?
That's a great question. The Nixon-Muir understanding was really a point of interest for me, just because when I started this project, I really couldn't believe that the policy is really that we don't talk about it. And then I spent a year researching it, and the policy is that we don't talk about it. It was a really interesting political moment specifically for that understanding in 1969, because the Nixon administration came in after the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and Nixon and Henry Kissinger personally were not very big fans of the nonproliferation compared to other priorities that they had. So by the time they came in, not only did Israel have a nuclear weapons capability, but they also were interested in kind of closing that book in that political moment, particularly because limiting public knowledge was huge because the U.S. was a major proponent of the NPT so soon before then. So it would have been very easy for the world to say, your ally has nuclear weapons and you didn't do anything. You're promoting this legislation. So that was a really big factor in that. To my knowledge, Israel is the only one that maintains that kind of status. And it really was maintained because of the very personal conversations and understandings between Israeli and U.S. Heads of state over that time.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak to how America's historic and continuing cultural proximity to Israel impacted how nuclear attitudes have changed or are evolving currently with respect to nonproliferation or counterproliferation.
Yeah, I think the Israeli program in particular was one of the most interesting for me to research, just because nuclear weapons decisions are always extremely pertinent in states, but I don't know that there was one that it was so pertinent as in the case of Israel, specifically with the founding of the state being in the shadow of the Holocaust and things like that. That was very much in leaders' minds at that time, as well as in U.S. policymakers' minds at that time. What really made the difference was that Israeli leaders were just extremely successful in prolonging that conversation. Both Ben-Gurion and Eshkol following him, they successfully made just enough promises to Kennedy and Johnson to keep them from intervening very much, except it was really just delayed up until the point where there was really nothing that the U.S. could do at that point.
I had a question. So you said we're kind of entering a new phase of nonproliferation. Do you think that's going to result, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, to more human rights violations for ordinary citizens in the region? Or do you think this is actually better for ordinary citizens in terms of the consequences of the U.S. intervention and action?
Yeah. I think that something that played a really particular role in this case was the role of Israel functioning almost as a proxy nonproliferation for the United States. Israel, when it has demonstrated this willingness to use force, it's been extremely targeted. They've assassinated very specific leaders in the Iranian nuclear program. They've struck very specific sites in the Iranian nuclear program. I think that it's much more calculated, in which sense I think that there is definitely a lot of concern for civilians being involved in these sorts of things. So I think that they will continue at that kind of level of really highly calculated and very, in that way.